The trailhead looked empty when I pulled into the gravel lot. The sun hung low in the sky, barely filtering through the thick canopy of trees. I checked the time, 4:27 p.m. I had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, but that was fine. The loop was just under 6 miles, something I could do at a steady pace before the woods swallowed the last of the light. I'd done this hike before, back when I first moved out here to Oregon. It wasn't the most popular trail, but I liked that about it. No tourists, no loud groups, just me and the trees. But this time it felt different. Maybe it was the season, late fall, when the leaves had mostly dropped and everything felt skeletal. Or maybe it was the silence. No birds, no wind, no distant hum of a highway, just my own breathing and the sound of my boots crunching over damp leaves. I pulled on my backpack, adjusting the straps, and started up the trail. It was an old logging road for the first mile, then narrowed into a dirt path winding through dense evergreens. About half a mile in, I noticed the first odd thing: fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were deeper, made by someone heavier, and heading in the same direction I was. I paused, scanning the trees. No one. The trailhead had been empty when I parked. Maybe they'd started earlier and their car wasn't there anymore. I kept walking, picking up my pace. After another mile, I saw something else. A sock. A single, dirty white sock just off the side of the trail. It was damp, balled up like it had been yanked off in a hurry. A little farther up, a granola bar wrapper. Then, a few steps later, another one. I slowed down. My gut tightened. Someone had come through here in a hurry, leaving things behind. I considered turning around, but I was nearly at the halfway point. I'd have to walk just as far back as I would going forward. And besides, there was no rule saying I couldn't hike with someone else ahead of me. But then I found the shoe. It was off-trail, maybe 5 feet into the trees. A men's hiking boot, mud-caked and worn. I swallowed hard. A missing shoe was a bad sign. People don't just lose their shoes. Not out here. I scanned the forest. Nothing. No movement. Just dead trees and thick undergrowth. My skin crawled. Something was wrong. I pushed forward, moving faster. The trail climbed steeply, switchbacking up the side of a ridge. I told myself I was being paranoid, that someone had lost their shoe, maybe sat down to rest, then walked out barefoot. Stupid, but possible. But then I smelled it. Something foul. Rotten, like spoiled meat left in the sun. The kind of smell that sticks to the back of your throat. I stopped, covering my nose. It was coming from up ahead, somewhere just off-trail. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. I stepped carefully into the undergrowth, pushing branches aside. The smell got stronger. I moved slower, ears straining. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A deer. At least what was left of one. Its body was torn open, ribs exposed like a broken umbrella. The flesh had been stripped in places, but not by scavengers. No bite marks, no signs of an animal kill. Just deep, deliberate cuts like something had carved it apart. I backed away, heart hammering. Then I heard it. A sound I can't quite explain. Not a growl, not a voice. Something in between. Low and guttural, vibrating in the cold air. I turned and ran. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I tore down the trail, legs shaking, ears straining for footsteps behind me. Nothing, just silence. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had dipped below the trees. My truck was still there, untouched. The lot was empty. I didn't look back. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out onto the gravel road. I never hiked that trail again. I don't think anyone should. I was 17 when it happened. It was the summer before my senior year, and I had spent most of the break restless, itching for something more than the monotony of my small-town life. The kind of boredom that settles in when you've seen everything there is to see, done everything worth doing. There was a stretch of woods about 20 miles outside of town. Nothing too special. Just dense trees, a few narrow trails, and an old fire tower that was supposedly off-limits. Nobody ever really enforced the rules out there. A few of my friends and I had been there a handful of times, but we'd never gone too deep into the trails. The stories about people getting lost, hikers vanishing, and search parties coming back empty-handed were enough to keep us cautious. But that summer, I was in a reckless mood. I wanted to see what was really out there. I convinced my friend Eric to go with me. He wasn't the type to go on long hikes, but he had a car and I needed a ride. I told him it'd be a short trek, just a few hours in and out. He wasn't thrilled, but I promised him a case of beer afterward. That sealed the deal. We set out in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low but still bright enough to cut through the trees. The trail started easy, hard-packed dirt, a few overgrown patches, nothing too wild. We walked in silence for a while, listening to the occasional rustle of leaves, the crunch of twigs underfoot. About an hour in, we reached a fork in the path. One way led toward the fire tower, the other deeper into the forest. We'd been to the tower before. It was rusted, covered in graffiti, and not nearly as exciting as the local rumors made it out to be. The other path, though, I had never taken it. I had never known anyone who had. "We should go back," Eric said. I shook my head. "Just a little further." He sighed but followed. The deeper we went, the more the forest changed. The trees grew thicker, closer together, their branches intertwining overhead until they blocked out most of the light. The air felt heavier, still, like something was watching. I tried to ignore it, probably just my mind playing tricks on me. We walked for another half hour before the path started to fade. The dirt gave way to uneven ground, patches of moss and tangled roots. The deeper we went, the less it felt like a trail at all. That's when we found the first marker. It was just a wooden post, half rotted, sticking out of the ground at an awkward angle. A symbol was carved into it, something that looked like a spiral looping inward over and over again. Eric frowned. "What the hell is that?"
No idea.
We should have turned back then. I think we both knew it, but neither of us wanted to be the first to say it. We kept walking. The next marker was different. Another wooden post, this one taller, sturdier. A crude figure was carved into it. A stickman with long arms, no eyes. I didn't like looking at it. Eric didn't either. "I think we should go back," he said. I agreed. We turned around and started retracing our steps. That's when we realized we didn't know where we were. The path had disappeared. Eric cursed under his breath. "This isn't right." We walked faster. The trees all looked the same.
No landmarks, no familiar terms.
Just endless forest stretching in every direction. The sun was setting. The temperature dropped. I felt it deep in my chest. A slow, creeping panic settling in. Then we saw the cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging in the middle. The windows were boarded up. The door was slightly open. "We shouldn't go in there," Eric said, but I was already stepping forward. The air inside was thick, stale. Dust clung to every surface. A single chair sat in the middle of the room. On the walls, more carvings, stick figures, spirals, shapes I didn't recognize. And on the floor, something worse. Bones. Small ones, scattered in a haphazard pile. Some broken, some whole. Eric swore. "We need to get out of here." I couldn't move. Something about the cabin felt wrong. Not just old or abandoned, wrong. Like we weren't supposed to be there. Like something was watching. Then we heard it. A sound from the trees. A low, guttural noise. Like something breathing. Just beyond the tree line. Eric grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." We ran. Branches whipped against my face, thorns snagged at my clothes. The forest blurred past, and I didn't care where we were going, as long as it was away from that cabin. And then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, the path was in front of us again. We didn't stop running until we saw the car. Neither of us spoke on the drive back. The radio stayed off. I stared out the window, my hands shaking. I never went back to those woods. I never even looked up the symbols or the carvings. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things are better left alone. Eric moved away a few years later. We lost touch, but sometimes late at night I think about that cabin, about the bones, about the sound in the trees, and I wonder if whatever was watching us that night ever left. It was late October when I decided to go on a solo hike through Pine Hollow Trail. I had been hiking for years, usually with friends, but this time, I wanted some time alone in the woods. Life had been stressful. Work was a mess with a new boss trying to change everything overnight, and I needed to clear my head. The air was crisp, the trees were mostly bare, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. It seemed like the perfect day for it. The trail was about 10 miles long, winding through dense forest with occasional clearings that overlooked the valley below. I started at around 10 in the morning, figuring I'd be back at my car before sundown. I packed light, some snacks, extra layers, a flashlight, and plenty of water. The first few miles were peaceful. I saw a couple of other hikers early on, but after that I was alone. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the birds seemed to be scarce. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional rustling of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. Around the 5-mile mark, I took a break at a small clearing. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and I sat on a fallen log, eating a granola bar while watching the wind shake the few remaining leaves from the trees. That's when I noticed it. A faint trail leading away from the main path, barely visible under the layer of leaves. It didn't look like an official part of the hike, but it was well trodden enough to show that people had used it before. Curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it led to a hidden lookout point, a shortcut? I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not unusual out here. I figured I'd walk a short distance down the path just to see where it went. If it got too sketchy, I turned back. The farther I went, the more overgrown the trail became. Branches reached across the path, forcing me to duck or push them aside. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and damp leaves that made each step feel uncertain. But something about it kept pulling me forward. Maybe it was the silence, so complete that even my footsteps felt muffled, or the way the trees seemed to close in tighter the farther I went. After about 15 minutes, I reached a clearing. In the center was an old wooden cabin, weathered and falling apart. The roof had partially caved in, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no smoke from a chimney. Just an abandoned, forgotten place deep in the woods. I should have turned back right then. Something about the place felt wrong. Not haunted or anything like that, just off. But I was already there, and my curiosity wouldn't let me leave without taking a closer look. I stepped onto the porch, and the wood creaked beneath my weight. Peering inside, I saw that the interior was just as decayed as the outside. A broken table, a rusted-out stove, and what looked like an old mattress, torn open with its stuffing spilling out. On the far wall, there was something scratched into the wood, tall, deep lines that didn't form words, just jagged symbols. That was enough for me. I turned to leave, but as I stepped off the porch, I heard something behind me, a rustling, like someone shifting their weight on dead leaves. My breath caught. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing, just the empty woods. Telling myself it was just my imagination, I picked up my pace. heading back the way I came. But after a few minutes, I realized something was wrong. I should have reached the main trail by now. The path I had taken wasn't long, and I had been walking fast, but I was still surrounded by dense trees. I stopped, took a deep breath, and turned around slowly, trying to get my bearings. The forest looked the same in every direction. My footprints should have been visible in the damp leaves, but they weren't. It was like the trail had disappeared behind me. Panic started to creep in. I reached for my phone, still no signal. My compass app wouldn't load, and I hadn't brought a physical one. Stupid. I knew better than that. I decided to keep walking in the direction I thought was right, hoping I'd eventually hit the main trail. But the deeper I went, the darker it got. The sun had been out when I first veered off the path, but now, even though it wasn't late in the day, the forest felt dim, like the trees were swallowing the light. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping, not behind me but ahead. I froze. My breath came in shallow, quiet gasps. Someone else was out here. I waited, listening. Nothing, just the heavy silence pressing in around me. I took a step forward, then another. Something moved to my left, a shadow between the trees. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. My pulse was hammering now. I wasn't alone. Trying to keep my breathing steady, I moved faster, forcing my way through the underbrush. I needed to find the trail. I needed to get out. But no matter how far I went, everything looked the same. Then, up ahead, I saw something through the trees, a structure. Relief flooded me. Maybe it was a ranger station, an old cabin, something. I hurried forward, pushing branches out of my way. But as I stepped into the clearing, my stomach dropped. It was the same cabin. I had gone in a circle. My mind raced. That wasn't possible. I had been walking in a straight line. I was sure of it. But there it was, the same collapsed roof, the same open door, the same strange carvings on the wall. Then, from inside the cabin, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight on the rotting floorboards. I didn't stop to think. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, not caring about the branches that scraped my arms and face. My only thought was getting away. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my own heartbeat. When I finally stopped, doubled over and gasping for air, I saw something through the trees, a break in the dense forest. I pushed forward and stumbled onto a familiar dirt path. The main trail. I nearly cried. I had never been so relieved in my life. Without looking back, I forced myself into a steady jog, not stopping until I saw the parking lot and my car waiting for me. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know how I got turned around or who or what was in that cabin. I don't want to know. I haven't gone back to Pine Hollow since, and I never will. I was never the kind of person to believe in bad omens. Growing up, my mom always told me that the world wasn't out to get me. That things happened and we dealt with them, simple as that. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever see the world that way again. It started as a simple hiking trip. Just me and my stepdad, Brian. My mom had married him 4 years ago, and things had been tense. He wasn't a bad guy, but he always needed to be right. About everything. The way to cook steak, how to pronounce caramel, even whether or not you should put ketchup on eggs. He was the type to argue about things no one else even thought about. And once he started, there was no stopping him. I usually tried to stay out of it, but sometimes it felt impossible, especially after what happened a few weeks before the trip. We'd had family over for dinner. My mom had made her famous lasagna, something she'd been perfecting for years. Brian had gotten it into his head that he was the real chef of the house, and he made some comment about how he could have made it better. I laughed, couldn't help it. The idea of him improving my mom's lasagna was hilarious. But Brian didn't think so. He challenged me to a cook-off, and to everyone's surprise, I won. He hadn't spoken to me much after that. A week later, he suggested a hiking trip. Just the two of us. He said it'd be good for us, help us bond. My mom thought it was a great idea. I wasn't sure, but I figured, why not? I loved hiking, and if it meant we could get past the awkwardness, maybe it'd be worth it. We left early in the morning. It was supposed to be a 2-day trip, a loop through the Cascade Mountains in Washington. We'd hike up one side of the valley, camp overnight, and come down the other side. It was about 20 miles in total, nothing I hadn't done before. I packed light but smart. Water, food, first aid kit. Brian, on the other hand, packed like we were going to war. Huge backpack, extra gear, even a big hunting knife strapped to his belt. You never know what could happen, he said when I asked about it. The first few miles were fine. The trail was well marked, the sun was shining, and we actually had a few decent conversations. I started to think maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all. But then, around mile 5, Brian started making comments. "Careful," he said when I stepped over a fallen branch. "Wouldn't want you to trip." "I know how to walk," I said. He smirked. "You sure about that?" I rolled my eyes and kept going. But the comments didn't stop. "Think you could start a fire if you needed to? Do you even know how to read a compass? You ever actually spend a night in the woods? Or just go on those easy day hikes?" First, I ignored him. But by the time we reached the clearing where we were going to camp, I was done. "Why did you even invite me on this trip if you were just going to act like this?" I snapped. Brian shrugged. "Just trying to help you toughen up. You're gonna need it one day." I shook my head and started setting up my tent. I didn't want to argue. Not out here. Not when we still had to spend the night together in the middle of nowhere. We ate in silence. Brian built a fire, and I sat on the opposite side, staring into the flames. The air was cooling fast, and the wind had picked up. The trees around us swayed, branches creaking in the breeze. I told myself it was just the wind, just the normal sounds of the forest, but something about it felt off. I didn't say anything to Brian. He would have just called me paranoid. I went to bed early, hoping I'd wake up to a better mood. But that night, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling our campsite. I held my breath, listening. It had to be an animal. A deer, maybe. Coyote. But the steps were heavy. Too heavy. And they weren't wandering, they were moving with purpose. Around and around. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers shaking. I hesitated before turning it on. I didn't want to see what was out there. I didn't want to know. But then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The night was silent. The wind had died down, and even the insects had gone quiet. The only sound was my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. I stayed awake for hours, listening, but nothing else happened. By morning, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Almost. Brian didn't mention anything about hearing noises, and I wasn't about to bring it up. We packed up and started the second half of our hike. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trees felt closer, the air heavier. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see something there. And then, around midday, we lost the trail. It shouldn't have been possible. The loop was well marked and we'd followed it exactly. But somehow, we had ended up in an area I didn't recognize. The trees were different, thicker, their branches twisted like reaching fingers. The ground sloped downward into a small ravine, the kind that could be dangerous if you weren't careful. "Great," Brian muttered. He pulled out the map and compass, frowning. "We must have taken a wrong turn." I didn't say anything. I was too busy listening. The forest was silent again, and then the footsteps came back. This time, they weren't circling. They were coming closer. I grabbed Brian's arm. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. He pulled out his hunting knife, turning in a slow circle. "Hello?" he called. No answer. The footsteps stopped. But I could feel it. Something watching us. Something just beyond the trees. "Let's go," I whispered. "Now." We moved fast, faster than we should have. The ground was uneven, the trees too close together. And then Brian slipped. His foot caught on a root, and he went down hard, sliding down the ravine before I could even react. I scrambled after him, my heart pounding. He was on his back, groaning, his ankle bent at a sickening angle. "I can't walk on this," he said through clenched teeth. Panic rose in my throat. We were miles from the nearest road, and we had no signal. I looked up at the trees, at the shadows shifting between them. The footsteps had started again, closer this time. I took a deep breath, tightening my grip on the straps of my backpack. We had to move. We had to get out of here, because whatever was out there, it wasn't going to wait forever, and neither were we. The trail stretched out ahead, swallowed by the thick, untamed forest. It was late September, and the air carried the sharp edge of oncoming winter. I had been hiking solo for years, taking long trips into the wilderness whenever I needed a break from the monotony of work. This time, I had chosen a remote trail in northern Montana, deep within the Lewis and Clark National Forest. The plan was simple: a 3-day out-and-back hike covering roughly 40 miles. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and the basics. I carried a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't reckless, just prepared. The first day was uneventful. The trail wound through dense pine and aspen forests, breaking open now and then to reveal stunning views of distant mountain peaks. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to refill my water at a cold, clear stream. That night, I set up camp near the base of a ridge. The air was cool but comfortable, and as I lay in my tent, I felt the familiar solitude settle in, something between peace and loneliness. I woke early the next morning and pressed on. The trail climbed higher, the trees thinning out as the elevation increased. Around noon, I spotted something odd, a backpack, half buried in the underbrush. It was old, weathered by seasons of exposure. I pulled it free, brushing off the dirt and leaves. It had been there a long time. The zippers were broken, the fabric faded. I dug through the contents. An empty water bottle, a rusted multi-tool, a single bootlace, and a notebook swollen from past rains. The pages were mostly illegible, but I could make out scattered phrases. "Been hearing it at night. Keeps watching from the ridge. Don't think I'm alone." A chill crawled up my spine. The rational part of my mind told me it was just an abandoned pack, lost by some unfortunate hiker years ago. But the words, faint and desperate, stayed with me. I continued on, pushing the unease aside. The terrain grew rougher. The trail was less maintained here, branches clawing at my jacket, the dirt loose beneath my boots. I was nearing the peak of the ridge when I saw another strange sight. A rusted, overturned hunting blind. It was about 50 feet off the trail, tangled in a thicket of deadfall. It looked like it had been torn from its tree and thrown to the ground. There were deep gouges in the metal frame. Claw marks, maybe. A bear? But something about the way it was destroyed didn't sit right with me. I kept moving. The sun was dipping lower when I decided to make camp. I found a relatively flat clearing and set up my tent. As I prepared my dinner, the silence around me felt different. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, distant rustling, seemed absent. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. not the scattered movements of a deer or the padding of a curious fox. These were deliberate, slow, human. I held my breath, straining to hear. My tent flap was zipped, but I could see the faint glow of moonlight outside. The footsteps stopped just beyond my camp. I waited. Minutes passed. Then something moved again, circling. Closer this time. My heart pounded. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The footsteps retreated. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening. At dawn, I packed up in record time. Every instinct screamed at me to get out. I took the same trail back, moving fast. The whole time I felt watched. The trees, the rocks. Something unseen lingered just beyond my vision. When I reached the spot where I had found the backpack, I stopped. It was gone. Not scattered, not torn apart. Just gone. I didn't stick around to investigate. I practically jogged the rest of the way, pushing past exhaustion, until I saw the parking lot. My truck was the only vehicle there. I threw my gear into the back and left without looking back. When I finally got home, I searched online for missing persons in the area. I found a name, Daniel Mason, vanished on that same trail in 2011. His last known location? The ridge. His pack had never been found. I had always loved hiking. Something about the isolation, the rhythm of my boots against dirt, the way the trees seemed to breathe with me. It all made me feel like I belonged out there. I wasn't an expert by any means, but I knew how to take care of myself in the woods. Pack light, bring enough water, keep an eye on the sun. That fall, I had some time off work and decided to push myself a little. I planned a solo overnight hike in the backwoods of northern Montana. Not an established trail, but an old logging road I'd read about on a forum. People said it had incredible views, deep forests, and hardly any foot traffic. That's what I wanted. Just me and the wilderness. I parked my car on the shoulder of a remote dirt road, checked my gear, and started walking. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick and fresh. Perfect day. The first few hours went smoothly. The path was overgrown, but I liked the challenge. It felt like I was stepping into forgotten land. As I hiked, I kept an eye out for a good place to set up camp before the sun dipped too low. Around 5 in the evening, I found a clearing beside a slow-moving stream. It was perfect. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore shoulders, and set up my tent. Dinner was a freeze-dried meal and a cup of instant coffee. The sky turned from gold to deep blue as the stars began to flicker awake. There was no cell service, of course, but that was part of the appeal. No notifications, no distractions. Just me and the quiet. Then I heard something. It wasn't loud. Just a rustling in the brush, maybe 30 feet away. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. I wasn't worried. Animals lived out here, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't just the sound, but the way it stopped the moment I noticed it. Like something had frozen in place, listening back. I clicked on my headlamp and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just the shifting shadows from the leaves. After a few minutes, I shook it off. Probably just my nerves playing tricks on me. I crawled into my tent and zipped myself in. My body was exhausted, but my mind kept replaying that sound. It was probably nothing. I told myself that over and over until sleep finally took me. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was pitch black, my breath visible in the cold air. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it again, movement just outside. Slow, deliberate. Not the scurrying of a small animal. Not the careless trampling of a deer. Something walking. I held my breath. It was close, right outside my tent. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, muscles locked, ears straining. 5 minutes? 10? The quiet stretched on until I convinced myself it was my imagination. But I didn't sleep after that. Every tiny sound sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. The night felt impossibly long. When the first gray light seeped through the fabric of my tent, I felt a rush of relief. I unzipped the flap and stepped out into the cold morning air. Everything looked normal. The trees stood still. The stream babbled quietly. No signs of anything unusual until I looked down. There, in the soft dirt surrounding my campsite, were footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet. They circled my tent. I don't know what made me want to go hiking that day. Maybe it was the weight of everything. The news, the market, the slow realization that the world around me was moving in a direction I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. I'd been drowning in numbers, in trends, in graphs that painted a picture of an economy I had less and less faith in. My mind was tangled with thoughts of inflation, stagnation, and the creeping suspicion that we were all just being led along by forces we couldn't control. So I left. I shut my laptop, laced up my boots, and decided I'd spend a day out in the mountains. No reception, no signals, just me and the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the dirt. I'd hiked this trail before, not often, but enough to feel confident I wouldn't get lost. The trail was tucked away, far from any of the more popular spots where families and tourists like to gather. It was a good hour's drive from my place, past a few scattered homes and deeper into the wilderness. I wasn't in the best shape, but I wasn't worried. I'd take it slow, let the fresh air clear my head. That was the plan. The first few miles were fine. The sun was high, though not too hot, and the trail was well worn. Birds flitted between branches, and the occasional rustling in the brush let me know I wasn't the only one out here. Probably deer, maybe a fox if I was lucky. But as I went further, something shifted. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, something at the edge of my senses. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker. The birdsong had faded, replaced by the distant creaking of trees swaying in the wind. I told myself it was normal. The deeper you go into the woods, the quieter it gets. That's just how it works. But the feeling stayed. I pressed on, pushing away the unease. The trail had started to narrow, winding up a ridge with loose gravel and sharp inclines. I took my time, making sure each step was steady. That's when I saw it. Something up ahead, just off the path. At first, I thought it was just a fallen tree, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was an old tent, collapsed, torn, and half buried under leaves and debris. It had been there a while, long enough for the colors to have faded, the fabric stiff with exposure. Next to it was a rusted-out camping stove, a few scattered cans, and a boot. Just one, lying on its side like someone had left in a hurry. I stopped, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. My first instinct was to look around, to scan the woods for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees, carrying with it a strange stillness that made my skin crawl. I don't know why, but I crouched down and unzipped the tent, just enough to peek inside. The smell hit me first, damp, stale, with something underneath that made my stomach turn. Inside, there was a sleeping bag, unzipped and crumpled, as if someone had left in a hurry. A flashlight, long dead, lay beside it. And then I saw the notebook. It was small, the kind you'd pick up at a gas station or a dollar store. The edges were curled from moisture, the ink smeared in places, but I could still make out the writing. The last entry was short. Something is wrong. I hear it at night. I thought it was the wind, but it's not. It's watching. I don't know if I can leave. I stood up so fast I nearly lost my footing. My pulse was hammering, my skin prickling with cold despite the sun still shining above. I needed to go. Now, I turned back toward the trail, forcing myself to walk instead of run. Running was dangerous on terrain like this, and the last thing I needed was to trip and break something. I told myself there was a logical explanation. Someone had camped here, had maybe gotten spooked by an animal, and left in a hurry. The woods are full of strange noises at night. It didn't mean anything, but as I made my way back, that heavy silence followed me. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching longer. Every step felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anything when I turned around. I pushed forward, my breath coming quicker, my legs burning. I just needed to get back to my car. Then, about a mile from the trailhead, I saw it. A second campsite. This one was newer, the tent still standing, though the entrance was unzipped and flapping slightly in the wind. There was a folding chair knocked over, an empty water bottle lying beside it. The fire pit was cold, the ashes undisturbed. And then I saw the footprints, deep, erratic, leading away from the tent and disappearing into the trees. I didn't check inside. I didn't want to know. I picked up my pace, practically jogging the rest of the way. My car was where I left it, nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. But as I yanked open the door and slid into the driver's seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, just beyond the tree line, watching. I haven't been back since. I don't plan to, and I don't know who wrote that last entry, but I believe them. I don't know why I went alone. It was stupid. I knew better than to take on a trail that deep in the mountains without anyone knowing where I was. But I had been feeling restless, and hiking had always been my way of getting my head straight. The news was filled with political chaos, things that didn't seem real. I just needed to get away, clear my mind. I drove 3 hours from the city to a trailhead I had never been to before. It wasn't in any of the usual hiking apps or books. I had stumbled across a forum post about it. Just a few sentences and a vague GPS coordinate. No official name, just the old line. The post was old, barely any interaction, but something about it stuck with me. The kind of thing that nags at the back of your mind until you give in. The parking lot was empty. That should have been my first warning. It was mid-September, still warm, still prime hiking season. But there were no cars, no signs, just a narrow dirt path leading into the trees. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was overgrown but manageable. I passed old mile markers, the numbers barely visible under decades of moss. The air was thick, damp, the kind of humid that clings to your skin and makes your clothes feel heavier than they are. I kept walking. By the time I realized I hadn't seen any wildlife, I was already too far in to turn back.
No birds, no insects.
Just the occasional rustling of leaves, but even that didn't sound right, like something shifting just out of sight. Then the trees changed. I've hiked all over the country. I know how forests are supposed to look, how they shift with the altitude and soil. But this was different. The bark of the trees had deep gashes, like something had clawed through them. The leaves overhead were thicker, blocking out more sunlight than they should have. It felt wrong, like I had crossed into some place I wasn't supposed to be. That's when I heard it. A low hum, distant at first, almost like the vibration of power lines. But there were no power lines out here. No roads, no buildings, just that sound, growing louder, filling the air until I could feel it in my bones. I kept walking, but I wasn't sure why. Something pulled me forward. The hum turned into a droning noise, rhythmic, almost like chanting. The trees grew denser, the path narrower. I wasn't sure when I had stopped seeing the sky. Then I saw the light. It was artificial, pale, flickering between the trees ahead. I moved toward it, slow, careful. The ground beneath my boots felt softer, like I was stepping on something that wasn't just dirt and leaves. I reached a clearing. It first, I thought it was an abandoned facility. Chain link fencing, rusted and sagging. A squat concrete building, the kind that looked like it had been built in a rush decades ago and forgotten. No signs.
No markings.
Just a set of steel doors, slightly open, and that humming, now vibrating the air around me. I should have left. I should have turned around and run. But I stepped inside. The inside was worse. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, some shattered, others barely clinging to life. Desks, chairs, scattered papers, like people had left in a hurry. But it didn't look old. There was no dust, no signs of nature reclaiming the space, just emptiness. Then I heard the footsteps. They weren't mine. I turned a corner and saw the monitors. Rows of them still running, displaying maps, lists, files, and a name that I recognized, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I froze. This didn't make sense. That was a government agency. I had heard the reports, something about a sudden shutdown, some executive order. But why was there an abandoned facility out here in the middle of nowhere still running their systems? Then the screens changed. One by one, they flickered, static overtaking the text. Then images, security feeds, the building, the hallways, the woods outside, and then me, a grainy, black and white image of myself standing in front of the monitors. I turned, heart pounding, expecting. What? Person? A camera? But the room was empty, just me and the screens. Then the lights went out. I don't remember running. I don't remember getting back to the trail. But suddenly, I was outside, breath ragged. The trees seeming taller, thicker, like they had shifted in my absence. The humming was gone. The air was still. I don't know how long it took me to reach my car. The sun was lower than it should have been. My hands shook as I started the engine, peeling out of the empty lot without looking back. When I got home, I searched for any mention of that place. Nothing. The forum post was gone. The coordinates led to a blank section of the map. The IMLS was still being shut down, but no one was talking about where it had gone. And then, 2 nights later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being alone in the woods, away from everything, that makes the world feel a little less suffocating. It's just you, the sound of your boots against the dirt, the wind moving through the trees, the distant calls of birds you can't quite place. The silence out there is different from the silence of an empty house or a quiet street. It's alive. It breathes with you. I started hiking alone when I was 16. My dad had taken me on plenty of trips when I was younger, and by the time I was old enough to drive, I wanted to do it on my own. I liked the solitude. I liked the independence. I liked the feeling that out there, I was just another animal moving through the trees, no expectations, no deadlines, no responsibilities beyond my own survival. This hike was different. It was early October, the best time of year for hiking. The air was cool but not cold, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I had planned a 3-day solo hike in the mountains, nothing too dangerous but far enough off the beaten path that I wouldn't run into too many people. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit. I had done this enough times to know what I needed. The first day went fine. I covered about 10 miles, set up camp near a small stream, and spent the evening watching the fire crackle and pop. The stars were bright. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. The second day was when things started to feel off. It started with a noise. I had been hiking for about 4 hours when I heard it, a rustling in the trees behind me. I stopped listening, but the forest went still. Probably just an animal. A deer, maybe. I kept walking. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was closer. I stopped again, turning to look behind me. Nothing, just trees and fallen leaves. The wind was picking up slightly, making the branches sway. I told myself it was just my imagination and kept moving. But the feeling didn't go away. There was something unnatural about the way the sound followed me. It wasn't constant, just enough to keep me on edge. A few steps, a pause. A few more steps, another rustle. I sped up my pace, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. By the time I set up camp that evening, I felt drained. The unease had stayed with me the entire day, making every little sound seem like something lurking just out of sight. I had never felt this way in the woods before. I had always been comfortable out here, but now I felt exposed. I built my fire a little bigger than usual. The light made me feel safer, but the shadows beyond the fire line seemed darker than they should have. I ate my dinner quickly and got into my tent, forcing myself to relax. It's nothing, I told myself. Just your nerves. Just your imagination. I woke up sometime in the night to the sound of breathing outside my tent. It was slow and deliberate. Not an animal sniffing around, not the wind moving through the trees. It was close. I held my breath, listening. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, then stopped. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I packed up fast. I didn't eat, didn't waste time. I just wanted to get out. I hadn't seen anything, hadn't found any tracks, but my gut was screaming at me to leave. I started walking at a near jog, my pack feeling heavier than ever. That's when I noticed it. The trail looked different. At first, I thought I had just been too distracted to notice before, but the further I went, the more certain I was that something was wrong. The trees didn't look familiar. The landmarks I had marked in my head weren't there. It was like I had taken a wrong turn, but I knew I hadn't. I stopped, trying to get my bearings. I checked my map, my compass. Everything said I was going the right way, but the forest around me told a different story. Panic started to creep in. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I had enough experience to know that getting lost could be deadly. I needed to think. I needed to retrace my steps. I turned around. The trail behind me was gone. I stood there, frozen. My footprints were there in the dirt, leading back the way I came, but the path itself had vanished. It was just trees and undergrowth, thick and impenetrable. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't possible. I walked back a few steps, pushing through the brush, trying to find where the trail should be. It wasn't there. I turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of it. My heart was hammering. My breath came fast and shallow. I needed to move. Standing still wasn't going to help. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping I'd come across the trail again. But the more I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. The sunlight barely made it through the canopy. I checked my compass again. The needle was spinning in slow, lazy circles. I stopped. Something was very, very wrong. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. My legs ached. My throat was dry. My mind was screaming at me to run, but I had no idea where to go. Every direction felt wrong. Every tree looked the same. Then, just as the sun started to dip behind the mountains, I saw something through the trees. A cabin. It was old, the wood gray and weathered. The roof sagged slightly, the windows dark. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life. But at that moment, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I stumbled toward it, desperate. I didn't care if it was abandoned. I just needed shelter. I reached the door and pushed it open without hesitation. The inside was empty. A single wooden chair sat in the center of the room. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust. But it was shelter. I shut the door behind me, locking it, and sank to the floor. I was safe. I was safe. Then I saw the footprints in the dust. Not mine. Not old. Fresh. I wasn't alone. I had planned the hiking trip months in advance. It was something I did every year, a way to clear my head and get away from the constant tension that followed me like a shadow. My kids, Ryan, 8, and Lucas, 6, were with me for the weekend, and I wanted them to experience the kind of peace I found in nature, something they rarely got at home. Their mother, Vanessa, had remarried last year. Her husband, Greg, had been an issue since he first came into the picture. He had no respect for me as their father, constantly trying to push me out of the picture. Every event, every exchange, every minor interaction was a power struggle. I had documented it all, 30 separate incidents by the time Vanessa and I ended up in court again. The judge had sided with me, warning Vanessa that Greg's behavior could cost her custody, that had at least kept him away from pickups and drop-offs, but the tension never really left. I knew Greg didn't like me taking the boys on this trip. I could hear it in his voice when Vanessa told me over the phone, "Just make sure you keep them safe." It wasn't concern, it was an accusation, like I was some kind of danger to my own kids. The trail we were hiking was deep in the northern woods, about 3 hours from where we lived. I had taken this route plenty of times before, but never with the boys. It wasn't an easy trail, but it wasn't anything they couldn't handle. I made sure of that. We started off early in the morning, the crisp air biting at our skin as we walked. Ryan was leading the way, excited to be in charge, while Lucas stayed close to me. The trees stretched high above us, their bare branches rattling against one another in the wind. Fall had stripped the leaves from most of them, leaving the woods feeling more open yet somehow more desolate. The first few miles were smooth. The boys took turns spotting birds and pointing out different types of mushrooms growing along the path. I was finally starting to relax when Ryan suddenly stopped ahead of me. "Dad?" he said, looking back at me with a frown. "There's someone up there." I followed his gaze and saw a figure standing further up the trail. He was dressed in dark clothes, standing completely still, facing away from us. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Hikers take this trail all the time," I said, keeping my voice light. "Come on, let's keep moving." As we got closer, the man turned slightly, just enough that I could see his profile. My heart dropped. It was Greg. He shouldn't have been here. He had no reason to be here. Vanessa hadn't mentioned anything about him going on a trip this weekend, and even if she had, what were the chances of him being on the exact same trail at the exact same time? "Dad?" Lucas whispered, his small fingers gripping my sleeve. He had recognized Greg too. I forced a smile. "It's fine, buddy. Let's just keep going." Greg didn't move as we walked past him. I didn't acknowledge him, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd rattled me. But I could feel his eyes on us, watching as we continued down the trail. After about 15 minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. He was gone. I tried to shake it off, but an uneasy feeling settled deep in my gut. We weren't in a place where people just happened to be. This was miles from any main road, a trail that required planning and effort to get to. And Greg had been there alone, just standing there. The day stretched on, and I did my best to push it from my mind. We reached the campsite by late afternoon, a small clearing nestled between two hills. I let the boys help set up the tent, teaching them how to drive the stakes into the ground and secure the rain cover. They were excited to sleep outside, their earlier unease forgotten. I wished I could say the same. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like something alive. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The boys were tucked into their sleeping bags, their breathing slow and steady. I sat outside for a while, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over the fallen leaves just beyond the fire's glow. I didn't move. My hand tightened around the knife I always carried when camping. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched on, heavy and unnatural. I strained my ears, waiting for anything. A breath, a shift in the leaves, anything. Nothing. I stood, my body tense. I scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the fire's light. The woods were too thick. Then, just as I was about to call it paranoia and go inside the tent, something moved at the edge of the clearing. A figure just beyond the tree line. Greg. He was standing there, half hidden by the darkness, watching. A surge of rage and fear shot through me. I took a step forward, my voice low and firm. "What the hell are you doing here?" He didn't answer. He didn't move. I took another step. "You need to leave. Now." Still nothing. And then, as if I had imagined him, he turned and melted into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up quickly. The boys were groggy, confused by my urgency, but I told them we had to head back early. I wasn't going to risk another night out here. As we hiked back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Greg again. But the trail was empty. We reached the car by midday, and I didn't relax until we were miles away from those woods. My hands were still gripping the wheel too tightly when my phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. "Greg says he saw you out hiking. The boys didn't even say hi to him? That's rude." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Greg had followed us. He had gone out there, knowing exactly where we were, and waited. For what? To scare me? To prove something? Or was it worse than that? I didn't answer the text. I just drove. I wasn't taking the boys hiking again anytime soon. The trail stretched endlessly ahead, winding through the thick canopy of the Pacific Northwest forest. I'd always loved hiking. There was something peaceful about being surrounded by towering pines and the crisp scent of damp earth. But today, the air felt different, heavy, stifling, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan, my partner of nearly a decade, walked a few steps ahead, his broad shoulders shifting under his pack. He'd been unusually quiet since we set off that morning. At first, I figured it was exhaustion from the drive or the weight of our packs, but something in the way he carried himself unsettled me. It was as if he was deep in thought, or worse, lost in something I couldn't understand. I tried to shake off the feeling. We had planned this trip for months. A weekend getaway, just the two of us, away from the stress of home, the demands of our kids, and the endless cycle of responsibility. A chance to reconnect. But after last night, after what had happened between us, I wasn't sure if I even wanted that anymore. The night had unraveled in a way I never expected. We'd put the kids to bed, and I'd settled onto the couch, eager to talk. Ethan was the only adult I had to talk to outside of my mother. But instead of listening, he had other things on his mind. Handsy, persistent. I told him no. I had made it clear so many times that I didn't want more children. I was ovulating and he refused to wear condoms. That was how our second child had happened, after all. But Ethan didn't let up. Eventually, I caved, trying to control the situation by making him wear protection. I even put it on him myself. But it didn't matter. He took what he wanted anyway. I didn't realize what had happened until I felt it, warm and wrong against my skin, and he laughed. I had cried myself to sleep while he rolled over like nothing had happened. The weight of it pressed against me now, as we trekked deeper into the wilderness. I didn't know why I still came on this trip. The trees pressed in closer as the trail narrowed. The The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the damp earth. My pack felt heavier than it should have. Every muscle in my body ached with exhaustion, but I didn't complain. I needed to keep moving. If I stopped, I'd have to think. And thinking was unbearable right now. Almost to the sight, Ethan finally said over his shoulder. His voice was calm, casual, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't spent the entire night drowning in a flood of emotions I couldn't even name. I didn't answer. He must have noticed because he slowed his pace until he was walking beside me. "You okay?" The question made my stomach twist. I wanted to say something, scream at him, tell him that what he did was a betrayal I couldn't forgive. But I just kept walking. What was the point? He'd already made it clear that my feelings didn't matter. The sun was beginning to set by the time we reached the clearing where we planned to camp. The lake nearby reflected the fading light, its surface still and dark. Ethan set down his pack and started setting up the tent, while I stood frozen, staring into the trees. Something about this place felt wrong. Not in a supernatural way, not like ghosts or monsters, just wrong. I couldn't tell if it was the place or if it was just me. "You gonna help, or?" Ethan's voice pulled me back. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move, helping him pitch the tent, gather firewood, and prepare for the night. The motions felt mechanical. My hands trembled when I tried to light the fire, and I wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or something deeper. We sat in silence as the flames flickered between us. The weight of the day pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. The woods were eerily quiet now. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of birds. Just silence. Then a sound. A snap, deep in the woods. I froze. Ethan didn't seem to notice. He was staring into the fire, lost in his own thoughts. Another snap, closer this time. My heart pounded. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up. "Hear what?" The woods swallowed the sound before I could answer. My gut told me we weren't alone. I always liked hiking alone. It was something about the silence, the solitude, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just me and the trees. It felt safe, predictable, until it didn't. Last October, I took a trip to Wyoming. Not Yellowstone or the Tetons, too many people. I wanted somewhere quieter, so I picked the Wind River Range. It was remote, rugged, and beautiful, everything I wanted. I planned a 5-day loop through the mountains, just me, my pack, and the trail. The first 3 days were perfect. The air was crisp, the leaves were golden, and the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels over the valleys. I barely saw another soul. On the 4th day, I reached the highest point of my route, a rocky ridge with a view stretching for miles. That's when I saw it, something unnatural. At first, I thought it was just an old structure, maybe a fire lookout long abandoned. But as I got closer, I saw it wasn't a building. It was a tent, a single, weathered tent, collapsed in on itself like it had been there for years. No trail led to it, no signs of a campsite, just that tent, tucked between the rocks, like someone had left it in a hurry. I should have walked away. I should have kept moving. But curiosity is a terrible thing in the wilderness. I stepped closer, nudging the fabric with my boot, crumbled like dry leaves, disintegrating into dust. That's when I saw what was inside. A backpack, faded blue, half buried under rocks. A water bottle empty, pair of hiking boots, still laced, and a notebook, its pages curled with age. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I opened it. The first few pages were normal dates, locations, notes on the weather. Then the writing changed. The letters grew jagged, desperate. Underscore something is following me. Underscore I swallowed. my breath catching in my throat. I turned the page. Underscore, I hear it at night. Breathing, moving. It never comes close, but it never leaves. Underscore, another page. Underscore, I found footprints. Not mine, not a bear's. Too human, too wrong. Underscore, my pulse pounded in my ears. I flipped to the last entry, scrawled in frantic slashes of ink. Underscore, if you find this, please tell my wife I tried to come home. Underscore, no name, no address, just that one plea. I stood up fast, suddenly feeling exposed. The wind howled through the rocks, and the late afternoon sun cast long skeletal shadows. I looked around. The mountains stretched empty before me, but for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I left the notebook. I left the tent. I hiked faster than I ever had before, not stopping until I was miles away. That night, I barely slept, every rustle of the wind making my heart race. By the next afternoon, I was back at my truck, throwing my gear inside without bothering to pack it properly. As I started the engine, I hesitated. Should I tell someone? Report the tent? The notebook? But something deep in my gut told me no one would believe me. It was just an old, forgotten camp. Just a story left behind in the dirt. But I knew the truth. Something had been out there with him, and I had a feeling it had been watching me too. The trail was supposed to be an easy one, just a quiet, scenic hike through the dense Oregon woods. I had done plenty of hikes before, but this one was different. It wasn't just about getting outside and breathing fresh air. This time I was hiking alone, pushing myself to go further than I ever had before. I wanted the solitude, the peace, but looking back now, I wish I had never stepped foot on that trail. I parked my car at the trailhead just before noon. The sky was overcast, gray clouds stretching endlessly overhead, but the weather was mild. No rain in the forecast, just a cool breeze that made the towering evergreens sway slightly. I checked my gear, plenty of water, some protein bars, my GPS, and a small knife I always carried when hiking alone. My phone had a weak signal, but it was enough to send a quick text to my brother, letting him know where I was heading, just in case. The first few miles were peaceful. The ground was soft beneath my boots, a mix of damp soil and fallen pine needles. Birds called out from the trees, and every so often, I caught the rustle of some small animals scurrying through the underbrush. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the quiet. It was exactly what I had hoped for. No people, no noise, just the forest and me. But about 5 miles in, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a feeling in the pit of my stomach. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker. I stopped and listened, realizing that the birds had gone quiet. The rustling in the bushes had stopped. There was nothing but the distant creaking of tree branches swaying in the wind. I tried to shake it off. Sometimes nature just got quiet. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bobcat or even a bear. I tightened the straps on my backpack and pressed forward, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. Then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth, and they didn't belong to any animal. They were human, barefoot. The prints were slightly wider than normal, the toes spread apart unnaturally. At first, I thought maybe some crazy person was hiking without shoes. But as I followed the tracks with my eyes, I realized something was off. The stride was too long, as if whoever left them had been running. And the deeper impressions in the soil made it look like they had been running on their toes, almost like an animal. I swallowed hard and kept moving. I wasn't going to let some weird footprints scare me, but I did pull my knife from my pack and keep it in my hand, just in case. A mile later, the forest started to feel wrong. The trees were thicker here, their trunks dark and gnarled, and the underbrush had nearly disappeared. The ground was covered in patches of moss, and every step I took felt muted, like the earth was swallowing up the sound of my boots. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I saw it. About 30 feet ahead, half hidden behind a tree, was a figure. I stopped dead in my tracks. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It looked like a man, but something about the way he stood was all wrong. His back was too straight, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His skin was pale, almost gray in the dim light filtering through the trees. And he was barefoot. The moment I saw his feet, my stomach dropped. They matched the prints I had seen. For a long time, neither of us moved. I could barely breathe. My mind was screaming at me to turn and run, but my body was frozen. The figure twitched, and I swear I heard a faint cracking sound, like joints popping. Then, slowly, he stepped out from behind the tree. That's when I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just turned and sprinted, my boots pounding against the soft earth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea where I was going. I had long since lost the trail. All I knew was that I had to get away. Branches whipped against my arms and face, but I didn't stop. I could hear something behind me, the soft, rapid thudding of footsteps. And they weren't normal footsteps. They were too fast, too light, like whatever was chasing me wasn't quite human. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't slow down. I don't know how long I ran. Time felt warped, stretched thin by fear and adrenaline. But eventually, I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a gravel road. My knees buckled, and I collapsed, gasping for breath. The silence was deafening. I turned back toward the forest, my chest heaving. There was nothing there, no movement, no strange, barefoot man, just trees, standing still and silent as if they had never seen me run for my life. I forced myself to my feet and followed the road until I found my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I almost cried. I never reported what happened. What would I even say? That I saw some barefoot person in the woods? That I was chased by something I still can't explain? I never went back to that trail, and I never will. I had been hiking for years, always alone. There was something about the quiet of the woods that settled my mind, let me be with my thoughts. I wasn't reckless, though. I knew my limits, carried the right gear, told someone where I was going. It was routine by now, but routines have a way of making you feel safe, sometimes too safe. It was late fall, the time when the woods are mostly empty, too cold for casual hikers, but not yet blanketed in the kind of snow that would make trails impassable. I had picked a trail I hadn't done before, a long loop through the hills of western Pennsylvania, far from any towns. It wasn't a place with a dark history. No disappearances, no ghost stories, just a quiet, remote stretch of forest. That was what I wanted. A new place, new sights, but nothing that felt dangerous. I set out early, the sky still pale from the rising sun, my pack loaded with everything I might need. Extra layers, food, a knife, my compass, a small first aid kit. I had a map of the area printed out, though I rarely needed one. I had my phone too, but I knew there'd be no signal out here. I was comfortable with that. The first few hours were perfect. The air was crisp, my boots crunching over fallen leaves. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. The trail was well marked but not overly maintained, the kind of path that felt natural, where you could believe you were the first to walk it in weeks. I passed a few empty campsites, ringed with fire pits long gone cold. I wasn't planning to stay overnight. I'd do the loop in a day, get back before dark. Somewhere around midday, I stopped for lunch on a ridge, looking out over miles of trees, the occasional glimpse of a stream far below. That was when I noticed something odd. There was a sound, faint but constant, somewhere below me. It wasn't the wind or rustling leaves. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but too steady, too mechanical. I thought maybe it was water, a small waterfall or rapids, but the more I listened, the less natural it sounded. I scanned the forest below but saw nothing. It was probably nothing, I told myself. A trick of the terrain, the way sound bounced through valleys. I finished eating, shouldered my pack, and moved on. An hour later, I had nearly forgotten the sound. The trail dipped into a hollow, the air cooler here, thick with the scent of decaying leaves. The trees pressed in close. That was when I saw them.
Bootprints.
Fresh. They weren't mine. That wasn't strange in itself. This was a public trail, after all. But the thing was, I hadn't seen any other footprints all day. No signs of recent hikers, no disturbances in the leaves. And these prints weren't heading in the direction I had come from. They were alongside mine, parallel, as if someone had been walking beside me just out of sight. I stopped, looking around, listening. Nothing. Just the distant rustling of branches in the wind. I pressed on, moving faster now. I wasn't scared. Not yet. But I was unsettled. My rational brain told me there had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had hiked this section of the trail early this morning before I got here. Maybe they had doubled back. But it didn't sit right. The prints were too crisp, too recent. I reached an intersection where the trail split. A longer route that curved up into the hills or a shorter path that would cut back toward where I had started. I had planned on the long route, but now I hesitated. That was when I heard it again. The sound from earlier. Only now it was closer, and it wasn't coming from below me anymore. It was behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing, but the sound was still there. A steady, deliberate rhythm. Not footsteps exactly, but close. I didn't call out. Every instinct in me told me not to. I took the shorter path. I walked quickly but didn't run. Running in the woods is a good way to get hurt, to lose your footing, twist an ankle, get lost. I kept my pace steady, trying not to let my fear take over. The sound followed. Sometimes it faded, sometimes it grew louder. It never stopped completely. I told myself it was paranoia, the way sound carried in the trees. I told myself I would see another set of boot prints soon, proof that someone else had been hiking here and I was imagining things. But I never did. The light was beginning to fade. I wasn't far now, just a few more miles. Then, ahead of me, I saw movement. I froze. A figure stood in the path, too far to make out clearly, just a dark shape against the trees. I didn't move. They didn't move. For what felt like minutes, we just stood there. Then I took a step forward. They did too. My stomach dropped. I turned and walked back the way I came. Slow at first, then faster. I could find another way back, cut through the trees if I had to. I knew how to navigate without a trail. I had no intention of walking toward that figure, of seeing what happened when I got close enough to see their face. The sound behind me returned, louder now. I left the path. I moved fast, dodging trees, pushing through underbrush. I kept my breathing steady. I didn't look back. Took longer than it should have, but I found another trail, one I recognized. It led to a parking lot, to my car. I ran then, the first time all day. When I reached my car, I unlocked it so fast I dropped the keys. I snatched them up, got inside, locked the doors. I sat there, hands gripping the wheel, staring at the trailhead. No one came out. I waited 10 minutes before starting the car. As I pulled out, my headlights swept over the edge of the trail, and I saw the boot prints, not just mine. A second set, ending abruptly at the tree line. I didn't stop. I haven't hiked alone since. I don't know how to explain what happened to me that day in the woods, and I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I swear, every word of this is true. I need to tell it, if only to get it out of my head. It happened last year in late September. I had taken time off work to clear my mind, and hiking has always been my go-to escape. There's something about being alone in the wilderness, away from the noise and expectations of everyday life, that gives me a kind of peace I can't find anywhere else. This time, I decided to try a trail I'd never hiked before, something more isolated. I had read about a path in upstate New York, about 4 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a touristy area, and from what I'd read online, it was rare to encounter other hikers on the trail. It sounded perfect. I left early in the morning, reaching the trailhead just as the sun was coming up. The air was crisp, and the leaves had started to turn. Fiery reds, deep oranges, and yellows that made the forest glow when the light hit just right. I was prepared. Water, protein bars, a first aid kit, flashlight, and a hunting knife. Not that I expected to need it, but you never know when you're alone in the woods. The first few miles were uneventful, just me and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and fallen leaves. Birds called in the distance, and somewhere, I heard the faint rustling of a deer moving through the trees. The further I hiked, the quieter it became. Then, at around the 5-mile mark, something changed. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like the air had shifted. The sounds of the forest disappeared. Not gradually, but all at once. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just silence. An unnatural, pressing silence. I stopped walking. My heartbeat sounded too loud in my ears. I held my breath, listening, but there was nothing. I had the sudden, unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I scanned the trees, looking for movement. Maybe another hiker? A large animal? But there was nothing. Just trees, stretching in every direction, motionless. I shook it off. I had read about this kind of thing before. Sometimes when a predator is near, the smaller animals go silent. Maybe there was a bear in the area, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I kept walking, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. My pace quickened. The further I went, the worse it got. The silence felt heavy, almost like a weight on my chest. I started hearing things. Small noises, just out of range, impossible to pinpoint. A branch snapping behind me, leaves rustling to my left. I turned each time, but I never saw anything. Then I noticed the trees. They were wrong. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but something about them made my stomach churn. The bark on some of them looked twisted, almost as if it had been melted and hardened again. Others had deep gashes running through them, like something had clawed at them. I stopped again, gripping the knife at my side. I wasn't easily scared, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn back. I wasn't a superstitious person, but I had the overwhelming sense that I had stepped somewhere I shouldn't be. I turned to head back the way I came, but then I heard it, a whisper. It was so quiet I almost didn't register it, but it was there, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, knife in hand, but there was nothing, just trees. Then it came again, closer. My breathing turned shallow. It wasn't the wind, it couldn't be. The air was completely still, but the whisper was right there, just behind me, too close. I ran. I don't think I've ever moved that fast in my life. I didn't care about the path, I just needed to get out. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes, my legs burning. The whisper didn't stop, followed me. It wasn't words, exactly. It was a sound, soft and slithering, almost like it was trying to be words but couldn't quite form them. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A cabin. I hadn't seen it on the way in. It shouldn't have been there. It was old, the wood dark and rotting. The door was slightly open, and inside there was movement. I didn't stop. I veered away from it, pushing myself harder than I thought I could. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see whatever had moved inside that cabin. I don't know how long I ran, But eventually, the whispering stopped. The silence lifted. The forest noises returned. Birds, the wind, the rustling leaves. I made it back to my car, breathless, hands shaking so hard I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove straight home, only stopping for gas when absolutely necessary. I haven't been hiking alone since. I don't know what I encountered in those woods. I don't think I ever want to know. But sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. That whisper. I could feel the trail shift under my boots as I pressed forward, the crunch of damp leaves and twigs filling the empty space around me. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that lingered deep in the lungs, grounding me in the present. I had come here to escape, to breathe. The week at work had been unbearable. Every conversation, every passing remark had been dripping with the same rhetoric, the same dismissive tone toward the things that mattered to me. The office was small, too small to avoid the constant political chatter. My boss, an Italian expat, and my American coworker, Mark, had been relentless in their praise for men I had no respect for. Trump, Musk. It was the same loop of conversations over and over again. I tried to keep my head down, to focus on my work, but the words stuck to me like sap, impossible to scrub off. So I left. I packed up my gear and drove hours out of the city, deep into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. The sun had started to dip below the tree line, the golden light filtering through the canopy in fractured pieces. The forest was dense, wrapping around the narrow trail like a tunnel. I welcomed the quiet. I had chosen a lesser-known trail, one that cut through miles of untouched wilderness. It was isolated, the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. That was the appeal. The further I got from people, the clearer my mind felt. I walked for hours, my pack growing heavier with each mile. My plan was to reach an old fire lookout before nightfall, a spot I had marked on my map. It was perched on a ridge, overlooking the valley below. I imagined the view would be worth the trek. As I climbed higher, the air grew thinner, colder. The trees were different here, their trunks twisted, gnarled by the wind. The path narrowed, forcing me to move carefully along the rocky ledge. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, a dark smear against the twilight sky. As I drew closer, the details became clearer. A backpack, torn, faded, abandoned on the edge of the trail. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. It had been there for a while, the fabric stiff with exposure. A single strap dangled over the side of the cliff, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach twisted. I hesitated before stepping closer. The pack was half unzipped, revealing clothes, a water bottle, a map. No food, no sign of its owner. My skin prickled. I glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. The trees stood silent, their branches unmoving despite the wind. The sun had nearly disappeared, leaving the world in shades of deep blue and gray. I knelt, reaching for the map. It was damp, the edges curling, the ink smudged. I could barely make out the markings, but it was clear this person had been heading in the same direction as me. Something moved in the trees, a shift, barely noticeable, but enough to send a jolt through my spine. I froze, my fingers tightening around the map. The silence was thick, pressing against my ears like cotton. Then, a whisper of movement, closer this time. I stood up, my pulse hammering. My mind raced through the possibilities. An animal? A lost hiker? My own paranoia? I turned, scanning the undergrowth. The trees stood tall, unyielding, their dark forms blending into one another. Nothing. I exhaled sharply, trying to steady myself. This was stupid. I was letting exhaustion and stress get to me. I left the pack where it was. There was nothing I could do. If someone was missing, they were long gone. I needed to keep moving. The last stretch of the hike was brutal. The incline was steep, the trail uneven, littered with loose rocks. My legs burned, my breath came in sharp gasps, but I pushed forward, driven by an unshakable need to reach the lookout. By the time I arrived, the night had fully settled in. The stars stretched endlessly above, their cold light illuminating the empty structure. The lookout was old, the wood worn and splintered, but it was sturdy, safe. I dropped my pack, my muscles screaming in relief. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, but I didn't care. I had made it. I sat against the railing, staring out at the valley below. The darkness stretched on forever, untouched, undisturbed. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Then a sound, soft, distant, but unmistakable. A whistle, not a bird, not the wind. A tune, high-pitched, followed by a low-pitched note.
Familiar.
My chest tightened. I had heard that tune before, but not here, not in the wilderness. It was the same whistle my coworker used when he wanted to get someone's attention in the office. The same pattern. The blood drained from my face. I stood up slowly, my fingers gripping the railing. My mind fought against the logic of it, against the impossibility. I turned toward the trail, my breath shallow. The trees stood motionless, black against the night sky. The trail was empty. Then again, the whistle. Closer. I grabbed my pack, my hands trembling. I didn't bother securing anything, just threw it over my shoulder and bolted. I ran, down the trail over rocks and roots, my legs screaming in protest. The trees blurred past me, shadows shifting, closing in. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be found. The whistle followed me, never frantic, never rushed, just the same steady tune. I didn't stop, not when my lungs burned, not when my feet threatened to give out. I ran until I saw the faint glow of my car's headlights in the distance, until I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I sat there, gasping for air, my hands white-knuckled against the steering wheel. The forest loomed behind me, silent once more. I didn't wait. I started the car, peeled out onto the road, and didn't stop driving until the trees were nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. I never went back to that trail. I quit my job a month later, and I never told anyone what happened. I don't know why I agreed to go hiking that day. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was pride, but looking back, I wish I had just stayed home. The whole thing started because my coworker, Mike, was bragging about this hidden trail he found. Said it wasn't on any of the maps, no markers, just pure, untouched wilderness. You'd love it, he told me, leaning back in his chair.
No tourists, no crowds.
Just you and the forest. Sounded perfect. I liked hiking, but I hated trails clogged with people who didn't know what they were doing. Families with screaming kids, guys blasting music from their backpacks. So when he offered to show me the way, I said yes. The hike started out fine. We drove about an hour outside the city to a small parking lot that barely fit 3 cars. No signs, just a dirt path leading into the woods. Mike led the way, pushing through thick brush like he'd done this 100 times. The trail wasn't well worn, but there was a path if you knew where to look. We hiked for about an hour before things started feeling off. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things that didn't sit right. The trees were too still, the air too quiet. I hadn't seen a single bird, not even a squirrel. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we weren't supposed to be there. Then I noticed something. The trees had marks on them, small, deliberate slashes in the bark, always in groups of 3. Trail markers, I asked. Mike shook his head. Not mine. That was the first time I felt something like fear creep in. If Mike didn't put them there, who did? And why? We kept going, but my unease grew with every step. The forest didn't feel natural anymore. Felt watched, like something was just out of sight, hidden in the trees, waiting. Then we found the cabin. It was old, almost swallowed by the forest. The roof half collapsed, vines creeping up the walls. No signs of life, no trails leading to it. Shouldn't have been there. Mike grinned like he'd found buried treasure. See? Told you this place was cool. I didn't think it was cool. I thought it was wrong. The door was slightly open, like someone had just stepped out and would be back any minute. Let's check it out, Mike said, already stepping forward. I wanted to say no. I should have said no, but I didn't. The inside was worse. Smelled like rot and old wood. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, but there were signs someone had been here. A rusted lantern, an old sleeping bag, a tin cup on a wooden table. Then I saw the notebook. It sat in the middle of the table, open, pages yellowed and curling at the edges. I picked it up, flipping through. Most of it was unreadable, water-damaged scribbles, ink smeared across the paper, but one sentence stood out, burned into the page like it had been written in desperation. Do not go past the creek. I showed it to Mike. He laughed. Probably some paranoid camper. Come on, let's go see what's past the creek. I hesitated, but he was already moving. The creek wasn't far. A thin ribbon of water cutting through the trees, barely knee-deep. I don't know why I felt so strongly about that warning, but something in my gut told me this was a line we weren't supposed to cross. Mike stepped over without a second thought. I followed. Everything changed. The forest looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. The silence was heavier, like the whole world was holding its breath. Then we heard it, a crunching sound, slow and deliberate. Footsteps. We weren't alone. I turned, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the feeling of being watched. Mike was grinning, but it was forced. Probably just a deer. I shook my head. Deer don't move like that. They don't follow you. We kept walking faster now. The footsteps followed. Always just out of sight, never too far. The deeper we went, the worse it got. Then Mike stopped. Do you hear that? I listened. Nothing. And that was the problem. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was dead silent again. Then something whispered my name. I ran. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care where I was going. I just ran. Mike was right behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear him breathing hard, cursing under his breath. We hit the creek, stumbling through the water. The moment my feet hit the other side, everything changed. The air felt lighter, the forest less suffocating. The feeling of being watched was gone. Mike bent over, hands on his knees. What the hell was that? I didn't answer. I just started walking back the way we came. We didn't talk the whole way back. When we reached the car, I turned to Mike. We don't tell anyone about this. He nodded. Agreed. I don't know what we found out there, but I know one thing: we should have listened to the warning. It started as an ordinary hike, one of those last-minute plans that seemed like a great idea at the time. I had the day off, and the forecast promised crisp autumn air, perfect for a long walk through the woods. The leaves were changing, and I figured it would be a nice way to clear my head. The trail was in a place called Black Hollow, about an hour outside of town. It wasn't particularly famous, just a quiet spot that some locals knew about. No big campgrounds, no tourist crowds, just a few winding paths through the trees. The kind of place that felt untouched, like people didn't belong there in the first place. I'd only been there once before, years ago, and I barely remembered it. I got there in the late morning, parked my car near the entrance, and started walking. The first few miles were uneventful, just the usual sounds of the forest. Leaves crunching underfoot, the occasional bird overhead, the wind stirring the branches. Peaceful. Exactly what I was looking for. It was only after I reached the halfway point of the loop, a little over 6 miles in, that I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, that creeping sense that something was just slightly off. I slowed down, listened, looked around, but everything seemed normal. Sunlight filtered through the trees. A squirrel darted across the path ahead. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear water, maybe a creek or a small waterfall, but the feeling didn't go away. I shook it off and kept going, but after another half mile, I noticed something strange. The trail didn't look right. I remembered it looping back toward the parking lot, curving gently downhill, but instead, the path in front of me kept climbing, winding up through the trees. It didn't make sense. I pulled out my phone to check my location, but of course, I had no signal. That wasn't unusual in the woods, but it still made my stomach tighten. I told myself I must have missed a turn. No big deal. I just backtrack until I found the right path. But when I turned around, the trail behind me looked different too. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't like I'd walked into another world or anything ridiculous like that. It was still the same forest, the same trees, the same autumn light slanting through the branches. But the trail itself, the one I just walked, felt wrong, like it had shifted when I wasn't looking. I tried to shake it off. I must have been overthinking it. Maybe I just hadn't been paying attention. Maybe I'd gotten turned around somehow. I took a slow breath, turned back the way I'd come, and started walking. But after a few minutes, I knew something was wrong. The landscape wasn't matching what I remembered. The trees were too thick, the ground too uneven. And then I saw it. A dead tree, half-rotted, leaning at an angle across the path. I hadn't passed it before. I was sure of that. I stopped, my pulse hammering in my throat. I had no idea where I was. I wasn't just lost. I was lost in a way that didn't make sense. For the first time, real fear started to creep in. I tried to force myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think. I pulled out my phone again. No service. Of course. I looked at the time. 3:12 p.m. Sunset would be in about 3 hours. I had time to get back if I could just find the right trail. I had a compass app on my phone, and I knew that the parking lot was west of where I'd started. If I could head west, I'd eventually hit a road or a familiar landmark. So I picked a direction and started walking. It didn't take long for the fear to settle deep in my bones. No matter how far I went, nothing looked familiar. Every time I thought I'd found a trail, it would twist in a way I didn't expect or fade into the underbrush. The forest was silent now. No birds, no rustling in the leaves. Just the sound of my own footsteps. And then I found the footprints. First, I was relieved. Footprints meant people. Maybe I wasn't as far off the trail as I thought. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. They were mine. I recognized the tread pattern on my boots, the slightly uneven step from an old knee injury. I had walked in a circle. My mouth went dry. I didn't understand how that was possible. I had been walking in a straight line. I was sure of it, but somehow I had looped back to where I'd started. I forced myself to keep moving, keep thinking. I tried again, picked another direction, walked for another 20 minutes, and then I saw them again. My own footprints. The panic hit me full force then. I tried to keep it down, tried to be logical, but my hands were shaking. This wasn't normal. I wasn't just lost. I was stuck, somehow, trapped. And then the sun started to set. I don't know how long I walked after that. Hours. I tried everything. Different directions, climbing a tree to look for landmarks, even screaming for help. But no one answered. And eventually, the dark came. It was the longest night of my life. I don't want to talk about all of it. Some of it I can't explain. But I will say this. I wasn't alone. I never saw anything. But I heard things. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, breathing. Sometimes close, sometimes far away. Always circling me. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the cold, gripping a rock in one hand, my phone in the other, watching the battery drain down to nothing. And when the sun finally rose, I started walking again. I don't know how long it took, but at some point, I stumbled out of the trees and onto a gravel road. A road I didn't recognize. A road that shouldn't have been there. But I didn't care. I followed it, and after what felt like forever, I saw a truck parked up ahead. A man standing beside it, loading something into the bed. I must have looked insane. Dirty, exhausted, wild-eyed. But he didn't ask questions. Just gave me a ride back to my car. When I checked my GPS later, it didn't make sense. The spot where I came out was miles from where I should have been. The trails didn't match. None of it matched. I don't know what happened out there. I don't go hiking alone anymore. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Hiking had always been my escape, my way of resetting when life felt overwhelming. The idea of getting out into the mountains, away from the noise, away from the daily routine, was the only thing that had kept me sane these past few weeks. But now, as I stood at the trailhead, adjusting the straps on my pack, I felt a weight pressing on me that had nothing to do with the gear I was carrying. I had always known that Emily liked to keep things organized. She had a system for everything: finances, schedules, even the way the kitchen cabinets were arranged. It used to be something I admired about her, something that made life easier. But over the past few weeks, I had discovered things that made me question everything. Started small, just little things here and there. Comments she made about places I had been, purchases I had made, things she shouldn't have known about unless she had been watching me more closely than I realized. First, I brushed it off. She was meticulous, sure, but I didn't think much of it. We'd been married for 18 years, had 2 kids together. Trust wasn't something I had ever really questioned before. But then came the moment that changed everything. I had been out of town for work. Emily had asked me to take some photos for her niece's school project, which I had done without a second thought. When I got home, I casually mentioned that I needed to send them to her. "I already did," she had said. It was such a simple sentence, but it hit me like a brick wall. I hadn't given her my phone. I hadn't sent the photos. And when I asked her how she had gotten them, the way she hesitated, the way her face changed, that's when I knew. She had been accessing my photos without my knowledge, without my permission. And the more I pressed, the more I realized it wasn't just the photos. She had been tracking me, watching me, monitoring more than she had ever let on. It had all unraveled from there. The way she had hidden it, the way she had lied, the way she had tried to cover her tracks even after she had already been caught. I had walked out that night, driving with no destination in mind, just needing space, needing to think. And now here I was, miles from home, trying to clear my head on a trail that had always brought me peace. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. The trail wound through dense forest, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, my place to breathe, but my thoughts wouldn't settle. My mind kept circling back to Emily, to the things she had done, to the way she had looked at me when she realized she had been caught. The sun was beginning to set when I reached the clearing. I had hiked this trail a dozen times before, knew the route like the back of my hand. The plan had been to set up camp, spend the night under the stars, let the silence work its magic. But something felt off. It wasn't the forest itself, Nothing looked out of place, but there was a feeling I couldn't shake, a sense that I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the trees, listening. Nothing, just my paranoia, my overactive mind still reeling from the past few weeks. I shook my head and set to work pitching my tent. I needed this trip. I needed the solitude. I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Dinner was simple, just a protein bar and some jerky. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to quiet my thoughts. I should have seen the signs sooner. I should have realized what was happening. But when you've trusted someone for nearly 2 decades, you don't question things like that. You don't think you need to. I shifted, adjusting my seat on the log, and felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I hadn't expected service out here, but when I pulled it out, a single notification stared back at me. Emily, why didn't you tell me where you were going? My stomach dropped. I hadn't told her. I had deliberately left without saying anything, needing space, needing time to think. There was no way she should have known. I swallowed, my fingers hovering over the screen. I could ignore it, pretend I hadn't seen it, but the dread creeping up my spine told me that wouldn't make a difference. She already knew. I turned my phone off and stuffed it back in my pocket, my mind racing. How had she known? Had she installed something on my phone? Had she tracked my car? The fire crackled, sending embers spiraling into the dark, but I barely noticed. My skin crawled with the feeling of being watched, the realization that even here, in the one place I thought I could be alone, she was still there. The wind shifted, rustling the trees. I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. There had to be an explanation. Maybe I had left a clue without realizing it. Maybe I was overreacting, but deep down I knew. I knew she had been watching me for a long time, and I knew this wasn't going to stop. I barely slept that night, my mind running in endless loops. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed up my gear, took one last look at the place that had once felt like home, and started down the trail. This wasn't about trust anymore. It wasn't about a simple mistake or an overstep. This was about control, about the fact that my life, my privacy, had never really been mine. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how this would end. But as I walked away from that campsite, from the life I had thought I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. I don't know why I decided to hike alone that day. I've always been careful, always stuck to the safer trails, and usually had at least one other person with me. But that morning, I woke up restless. My fiancée, Amanda, had been acting strange lately. Moody, distant, more irritable than usual. She was about 4 months pregnant, and I kept telling myself that it was just hormones. Still, something felt off in our house, like an energy I couldn't shake. I needed air. I needed to be out in the woods, away from all of it. So, I grabbed my gear, threw some snacks and a bottle of water into my pack, and drove out to the trails near Hawks Ridge, a quiet but steep forested area about 40 minutes from town. It wasn't an official park, just one of those places locals knew about. The kind of place where, if something went wrong, there was a good chance no one would find you for a while. I parked at the gravel lot, stepping out into the crisp morning air. It was early April, and the trees were just starting to bud. The scent of damp earth and pine filled my lungs as I started up the trail. The path was narrow but well-trodden, winding through a dense thicket of trees. First, it was peaceful. Birds chirped somewhere above, and the distant sound of a small stream trickled through the quiet. I walked for about an hour, climbing steadily upward, the incline making my legs burn just enough to feel satisfying. I didn't see another person the whole time. That wasn't unusual, though. It was a weekday morning and most people were at work. I tried to enjoy the solitude, but the further I went, the heavier the silence became. I don't mean normal silence. It was that thick, pressing kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The kind that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you can't see anyone. I kept walking, shaking it off. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The dirt was damp from last night's rain, and the prints were fresh. A single set heading in the same direction I was going. They were deep, like whoever made them had been moving fast, running, maybe. Something about them made my stomach knot. I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing, probably just another hiker. But the further I walked, the more I noticed things that felt wrong. A backpack sat abandoned near the base of a tree, half-zipped, with some of its contents spilled out. A water bottle, a granola bar, a single hiking boot. No one leaves their gear like that. I hesitated, looking around. "Hello," I called out. No answer. I listened for movement, but there was nothing. Just that same suffocating silence. I don't know why, but I stepped closer to the bag, nudging it with my foot. The boot next to it was covered in mud, the laces torn, like someone had yanked them apart in a hurry. That's when I noticed the scratch marks on the tree trunk. Long, deep gouges, like someone had dragged their fingernails down the bark. No, not fingernails, claw marks. A cold wave of fear settled over me. I turned back the way I came. I wasn't about to be the idiot in those missing hiker stories, the one who goes toward the danger instead of away from it. I started walking faster, almost jogging, my breath coming quicker now. Then I heard it. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. Not the kind of snap a squirrel or a bird makes. This was different, heavier, deliberate. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was there. I picked up my pace, practically running now. My heart hammered in my chest. I just needed to get back to my car. A quarter mile, maybe less. Then I heard the breathing. It was close, too close. Shallow, raspy, just behind me. I ran. I ran harder than I ever have in my life. The trees blurred past me. My lungs burned. My legs ached. But I didn't stop. I could feel it behind me. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was there. And then silence. I didn't stop running until I burst into the clearing where I'd parked my car. I scrambled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them. I snatched them up, jumped in, and slammed the doors locked. For a few minutes, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. I looked back toward the trail, half expecting to see something step out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty path, the quiet woods. I started the engine and tore out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I don't know what I saw, or what I almost saw, but I know one thing. I'm never hiking alone again.